Hello, and welcome back to another evening with the show that honestly, I'm not sure I'll ever fully stop thinking about. If you've been here before, you already know the drill. Get comfortable, dim whatever needs dimming, and let's spend some time together with Dexter Morgan, the bloodstained pattern analyst, the devoted father, the man who murders people in his spare time and keeps trophies in a bloodslide box in his air conditioning unit. You know, normal stuff. We've spent a couple of evenings already going through the show's more spectacular plotting decisions and the places where Miami Metro's finest demonstrate a level of investigative capability that can most charitably be described as optimistic. Those were good evenings, but tonight feels a bit different. Tonight I want to talk about theories. Now, I should be clear right away about what I mean by that, because the word theory has a certain reputation in online discourse. It tends to conjure images of people connecting red string across a corkboard and concluding that Dexter was secretly a time traveler, or that the whole show was a dream sequence, or that Harry Morgan is somehow still alive in a bunker somewhere orchestrating everything remotely. I'm not here for any of that. None of what we're going through tonight lives in that territory. These are grounded theories that are built directly from what's in the show itself, sometimes from things the show says quite explicitly and then seems to forget it said, sometimes from patterns in the writing that are doing something clever without ever announcing themselves loudly. The specific pleasure of Dexter, and this is something I've noticed more on rewatches than on the initial viewing, is that it operates on at least two levels simultaneously. On the surface, it's a very enjoyable, sometimes genuinely tense thriller about a serial killer who hunts serial killers. There's a dark procedural pleasure to it, the satisfaction of watching someone navigate extraordinary circumstances through a combination of intelligence and luck and careful planning. But underneath that surface, if you're willing to slow down and look at it, there's a character study. It's about trauma and identity, and what happens to a person when the adult responsible for shaping them had their own unacknowledged agenda. About what we inherit, about how the stories we tell ourselves about who we are can both protect us and limit us simultaneously. That second layer is where most of tonight's theories live. A few of them I find almost completely convincing. The kind where you go back and rewatch certain scenes and genuinely wonder how you didn't see it the first time, because it's so clearly there in the text once you know to look for it. A few are more like educated guesses, places where the show leaves something unresolved and one particular reading makes significantly more sense of it than any other available interpretation. And one or two are genuinely interesting ways of thinking about the show that I can't quite dismiss, even when I can't fully confirm them either. We're going to work through 9 of them tonight. I've tried to order them in a way that builds naturally because they do connect to one another. Several of these theories are essentially asking the same underlying question from different angles, using different characters and different seasons as the entry point. We'll start with the absolute foundation of the whole story and work outward from there, the way the show itself does, in circles that expand and intersect. One thing I want to say before we go any further, none of what we're talking about tonight is meant as a criticism of the show. I've said versions of this in previous videos, and I'll keep saying it because I mean it. Pointing out the layers underneath a piece of storytelling is an act of engagement, not attack. You don't analyze the architecture of a building you don't care about. The fact that Dexter still rewards this kind of attention, that it still has new things to offer after multiple rewatches and 2 franchise expansions, is evidence that it did something right from the beginning. These theories are the product of caring enough to pay close attention. If you're new here, welcome. Feel free to subscribe if the company is good, and I'll be back here for as long as there are evenings and a Dexter episode worth talking about. If you've been here before, I'm glad you're back. Get settled in. This one's going to take a while, and I mean that as a promise, not a warning. Let's begin. There's also something worth naming about the specific format tonight, the theory video, and why it feels different from a plot hole discussion or a ranking or a character retrospective. Theories are inherently collaborative in a way that other formats aren't. When you point out that Miami Metro would have solved every case in Season 2 if anyone had bothered to notice the obvious, that's a fairly settled observation. When you advance a theory, you're making an invitation. You're saying, here's a way of seeing it. Does it hold up for you? Does the evidence support it the way I think it does? I find that format genuinely pleasurable to be in because it means I'm not just delivering conclusions. We're thinking together if you want to think together, and if you want to just let it wash over you and drift off somewhere comfortable around Section 4, that's equally valid. The theories will be here when you come back. One thing I want to mention before we start, because it's relevant to some of what we'll discuss tonight. The franchise has expanded significantly since the original series ended in 2013. New Blood added a full season in 2021 and 2022. Original Sin, the prequel, ran through 2024 and into 2025. Resurrection started airing in 2025 and is ongoing at the time I'm recording this. Where I draw on material from the newer seasons, I'll try to be clear about it. Some of the theories tonight are primarily grounded in the original run. Some of them have been significantly enriched, complicated, or in a couple of cases vindicated by what the franchise has done since. There are also theories I'm not including tonight because I can't quite make the evidence hold. The idea that Dexter secretly found and visited Brian's grave every year, which some people have advanced with genuine passion, is a nice thought, but doesn't have textual support. The theory that Lila knew about Dexter's true nature before she burned the cabin, genuinely interesting, and I've seen good arguments for it, but the evidence is ambiguous enough that I can't make it the centerpiece of a section without feeling like I'm reaching. On another evening, maybe. Tonight we're staying in territory where the show itself is doing most of the evidentiary work. I want to add one more thing to the framing before we get into the theories themselves, which is about the nature of tonight specifically as a sleep video. The theory format has a particular quality to it that I think suits this kind of evening well. The late night, the comfortable position, the willingness to let ideas move through you rather than having to track them urgently. You're not going to be quizzed on any of this. There are no wrong answers about which theories hold up for you and which don't. The whole thing is an invitation to think gently about something, which is a very specific and underrated activity. What I like about watching Dexter, and I've watched it a number of times at this point, is that it rewards both kinds of attention. The first time through, it's a thriller. You're tracking the plot, the investigation, the near misses. The show is genuinely good at that level. But subsequent viewings are a completely different experience because the tension has gone, and what's left is the character and the structure and the things you missed when you were too busy worrying about whether LaGuerta would put it together this episode. The theories tonight are the product of the second kind of attention. They emerge from watching without urgency, from letting scenes develop their full weight before moving on, from noticing what the show is doing in the background while the plot is doing something else in the foreground. That's a mode of watching that suits a late night and a comfortable position perfectly. So wherever you are, in bed, on the sofa, half watching, while the world goes quiet around you. That's exactly the right context for this. The show rewards the attention. I hope tonight's theories do too. There's a moment in the very first episode of Dexter, the pilot, all the way back in 2006, where Harry Morgan explains, in flashback, how he came to find a 2-year-old boy at a crime scene in Miami's Port District. Laura Moser had been murdered there. 3 men had done it, chainsaw and all, as a message about the consequences of being a police informant. And when officers arrived at the scene, among the blood and the carnage of what had happened, they found a child, 2 years old. He'd been sitting there for approximately 36 hours before anyone came. He was physically unharmed. He wasn't crying by the time they found him. He was just sitting in the blood, quiet. Harry was the officer who came in first. He looked at what the child had seen, understood something instinctively before anything had been formally assessed about what that experience does to a developing mind, and made a decision to take the boy home. The show treats it as backstory, as context, as the explanation for why Dexter is the way he is. And that's all true as far as it goes. But if you watch the series all the way through all 8 original seasons, through New Blood, through what we've now seen of Resurrection, it becomes increasingly clear that those 36 hours aren't just the starting point. They're the engine. The whole franchise, in some fundamental sense, is still happening inside that container. Let me be specific about what I mean. The most direct line from the container to Dexter's compulsions is the obvious one, and the show states it fairly plainly. Exposure to traumatic violence at a developmental stage where the mind doesn't yet have the capacity to process it leaves a specific kind of mark, and Harry's read of what that mark would become was more or less correct. The compulsions, the comfort with blood, the need to control and contain, these are traceable to the container in the most straightforward psychological reading. That part isn't really a theory, it's the show's stated thesis. Consider Brian Moser. Brian was in that container too. He was older than Dexter when it happened, old enough to retain conscious memories of what he witnessed, which Dexter was too young to retain explicitly. And Brian became the ice truck killer. His entire method is bloodless crime scenes. He drains his victims completely and arranges them with extreme precision and care. No chaos, no blood, nothing left behind that disturbs the eye. If you think carefully about what a child who witnessed his mother's dismemberment in a pool of blood might be expressing when, as an adult, he begins leaving behind completely exsanguinated, immaculately arranged bodies. He's undoing it. He is going back to that moment and making it clean. He has spent decades trying to fix the container. Dexter's response is different, but equally rooted in exactly the same source. His kill rooms are wrapped in plastic sheeting, contained, controlled. He manages and organizes violence in ways that eliminate mess and unpredictability. He keeps the blood in, prevents it from spreading. He is, in a very literal sense, recreating the container, but this time with himself in control of what happens inside it. One brother erases blood, the other contains it. Two different solutions to the same problem. The show makes this parallel visible in season 1 without slowing down to highlight it. Brian's bloodless scenes and Dexter's sealed kill rooms are the same psychological gesture expressed in opposite directions. What's remarkable is that neither of them consciously knows the other exists through most of season 1. They've been working out the same trauma independently across years and distance and arrived at mirror image responses to it. Season 4. Arthur Mitchell murders Rita Morgan and leaves her in the bathtub of their home, having completed his ritual cycle. When Dexter arrives home and opens the bathroom door, he finds his wife dead in the water. And his infant son Harrison is sitting on the floor beside the tub in a pool of her blood, crying. The imagery is unmistakable, and it's not accidental. This is the container. It has reproduced itself. Another young child, another pool of blood, another dead mother, another set of psychological consequences now set into motion across the next several decades. The show knows exactly what it's doing in that moment. The Trinity killer specifically targets mothers of young children as part of his killing cycle, and Rita's death is the completion of that ritual. The writers are not reaching for a cheap echo. They are making a direct structural statement. The shipping container does not end with Dexter. It continues, which is precisely what New Blood confirms. Harrison, now a teenager, has been self-harming. He gravitates toward violent situations. He found Dexter not through any official means, but through years of obsessive searching. He needed to find the father who left him, the way, on some level, Dexter spent years needing Harry's framework. The child who sat in his mother's blood grew up carrying something, and that something found expression the only way wounds like that tend to know how. When Harrison kills Kurt Caldwell before Dexter can, takes action while Dexter is still in the process of planning. It's the container expressing itself in the next generation, not through conscious inheritance or teaching, but through the specific gravity of unresolved early trauma. And then Harrison shoots Dexter at the end of New Blood. He ends the cycle, or attempts to. Whether he succeeds is what Resurrection is still working out, because Dexter survived the gunshot and is now in New York, which is either the franchise confirming that the cycle cannot be cleanly ended, or it's a setup for a conclusion that's still coming. I find myself genuinely uncertain which, and I think that uncertainty is interesting rather than frustrating. The theory, stated as plainly as I can put it, the shipping container doesn't just explain Dexter's existence as the show's protagonist, it predicts the entire arc of the franchise. Every major turn, Brian's crimes, Rita's death, Harrison's trajectory, the recurring theme of cycles and what we pass to the people who follow us, flows directly and traceable from that container, from that moment. The show is not, at its core, about a serial killer who happens to hunt other serial killers. It's about a traumatic moment that never stopped reverberating. There's something almost unbearably melancholy about that reading once you sit with it for a moment. The idea that a 2-year-old boy's worst experience became the organizing principle of his entire life, and his biological brother's entire life, and his son's developing life, is genuinely difficult to hold in mind without feeling something. I find on rewatches that the container scenes are harder to watch than the kill scenes, because with the benefit of having seen what comes after, exactly where they eventually lead. One detail I keep returning to: Harry, the person who found Dexter in that container, is also the person who decided what to do with what he found. He didn't take the child to specialists. He adopted him and designed a system. Whether that decision was made purely out of love or partly out of guilt for his own role in what happened to Laura Moser is the next theory. And it changes the reading of everything that follows. Something that gets lost in discussions of the container and its aftermath is the specific psychological mechanism the show is invoking. Dexter's conscious memory of the event is essentially absent. He was 2 years old, and 2-year-olds don't retain explicit episodic memories in the way that older children and adults do. He knows intellectually that something happened. He knows he was found in blood. But the texture of the memory, the sounds, the cold, the particular quality of that time, is not available to him as something he can deliberately retrieve and examine. What is available to him is the embodied residue, the shape that the experience left in his nervous system before he had language for it. This is something trauma studies has consistently documented. Early childhood experience, even when it's not consciously retrievable, leaves marks in the body's automatic responses, in what triggers a feeling of threat or safety, in what produces comfort or agitation. Dexter's ease with blood, the way he's described as feeling calm and controlled at crime scenes while his colleagues experience the normal human revulsion, is the show invoking this mechanism. He was formed in blood. It read to his developing system as normal. The chaos of what happened became the baseline from which everything else was measured. Brian had explicit memory of it. This is the meaningful difference between them at the psychological level, and it produces the meaningful difference in their adult presentations. Brian knows what he saw. He carries it as a conscious narrative, a story he can access, think about, make decisions in relation to. His response to the container is therefore more deliberate, more symbolically coherent. The bloodless scenes are a thought-out statement. Dexter's response is more automatic, more driven by the body's logic rather than the mind's. The kill rooms are not a conscious statement about the container. They're the container's logic expressing itself through him without his full awareness of the connection. The show does give us one window into what that experience feels like from inside Dexter's memory. The recurring nightmares ring nightmares in early seasons. He occasionally has dreams that seem to approach the container without quite arriving there. Images of blood and confined spaces and the specific quality of being very small and unable to move. The show doesn't dwell on these at length, but they're present. They're the container leaking through the floor of his consciousness, trying to be processed by a mind that was not given the tools to process it. One of the details I find most interesting about the shipping container as a structural device is what the show does with its own silence around it. Very few characters explicitly discuss what happened in that container in any real detail. Harry knew and didn't tell Dexter much about it. Matthews knew and said very little. Vogel is aware of the backstory but approaches Dexter's psychology through the lens of the code rather than through the original trauma. There's an institutional reticence in the narrative around directly examining what happened, which mirrors Dexter's own reticence to look at it too directly. The show and its protagonist share the same avoidance pattern around the same source material. Season 2 gives us what might be the most direct engagement with the container's emotional content. Dexter tracking down Santos Jimenez, one of the men responsible for Laura Moser's death, and confronting him. The scene where he beats Jimenez in the bar, having explained who he is, having said, "I was one of the boys you left in her blood," is one of the most emotionally unguarded scenes in the whole original series. Dexter is rarely this direct about the emotional source of what he does. The container is right there on the surface, not processed, not framed in the code's language. Just the boy who was left in the blood standing in front of one of the men responsible. He doesn't kill Jimenez in that moment. Lila calls and he stops, which means the confrontation doesn't give him what he was looking for, because what he was looking for can't be provided by any individual outcome. The container is unresolvable. That's the theory's most uncomfortable implication. Dexter can hunt and kill and contain and control for his entire adult life, and Brian can clean the blood away scene by scene, and Harrison can try to end the cycle by removing its source. And none of it actually resolves what happened in that container in 1973 or whenever it was. The wound predates everything. Every response to it is downstream. The show is honest about this, in its quiet way. Nothing that happens across the franchise provides a clean resolution to the container because there isn't one. There's one more thread in the shipping container theory that I keep coming back to, which is what the container means for the show's use of blood as a visual motif. Blood in Dexter is doing a lot of work simultaneously. It's the forensic evidence that Dexter analyzes professionally. It's the medium of his kill rooms. It's the substance of his trophies. It's the thing he's been surrounded by since the beginning. The show's visual language around blood is distinctive, more clinical than gory, more controlled than chaotic, more aesthetically arranged than disturbing. The series made a consistent choice to film blood in a way that registers as significant rather than simply as horror genre visceral unpleasantness. This visual choice reflects Dexter's relationship to blood, which reflects the container. For Dexter, blood is not frightening, it's not repellent. It's familiar in the most fundamental way. The way the things that formed us earliest are familiar, not because we chose them, but because they arrived before we had preferences. The camera sees blood the way Dexter does, as organized, meaningful, readable. The show's entire visual register around its central motif is the shipping container's influence on how one specific person perceives the world. Contrast this with how blood functions in the moments the show steps outside Dexter's perspective. The discovery of Rita's body. The glimpse of what the Trinity killer left behind before Dexter's forensic eye makes sense of it. In those moments, the blood is chaotic, disturbing, wrong. The camera is no longer seeing through Dexter's formed-in-blood perception. It's seeing through normal human perception, and normal human perception finds blood exactly as horrible as it is. The container is literally in the cinematography, not as a conscious directorial statement every time, but as a consequence of the show's commitment to the protagonist's perspective. We see everything through eyes that were shaped in blood, and those eyes see blood as home. That's the container's deepest and most pervasive legacy in the show's formal language, and it runs through every season from the pilot to the finale without ever calling attention to itself. Brian, again, is the counterpoint. His bloodless scenes are the visual inverse. They're organized and precise in their own way, but without the blood that Dexter's scenes carry. Looking at the ice truck killer crime scenes and Dexter's kill rooms side by side, you see two different aesthetic responses to the same origin. One scrubbed clean, one carefully contained. Neither one is random. Both are the container's logic expressed through an adult man's practice. The franchise continuation in New Blood is interesting because Iron Lake is covered in snow. The white landscape, the frozen lake, the absence of the Miami heat and color. This is the show resetting the visual register for a Dexter who has been trying to suppress everything. No blood, no kill rooms, clean white everywhere. And then, when the dark passenger re-emerges, the contrast is stark in a way that's almost too on the nose, but works anyway. The blood against the white, the container's content against the blank suppression. Harry Morgan is presented throughout the series as the moral foundation of Dexter's world. He appears in flashbacks as a warm, measured, deeply thoughtful father figure, the kind of man who recognized something broken in his adopted son and, rather than sending that son away or handing him to an institution, stayed and tried to find a framework for it. The Code of Harry is the ethical scaffolding on which Dexter operates for the entire original series. Only kill people who have earned it, never get caught, never give yourself away. Harry, as Dexter understands and remembers him, did what he did out of love. I think that's partly true. I also think it's one of the more carefully constructed pieces of misdirection the series deploys. The complication arrives in Season 2, in a revelation that lands and is then somewhat underplayed amid the urgency of the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation. We learn that Laura Moser, Dexter's biological mother, the woman who was murdered in that shipping container at the port, was not just Harry's informant, she was his lover. Harry was having an affair with Laura while working with her as a confidential informant, and the investigation that ultimately got her killed was his investigation. She was targeted specifically because she was cooperating with police, and the police officer she was cooperating with was a man she was sleeping with. Harry's professional choices and personal entanglement are directly part of the chain of causation that ends with Laura Moser dead and two small boys sitting in her blood. Think carefully about what that means for the adoption. Harry didn't randomly encounter a traumatized child at a crime scene in the ordinary course of his work. He found the child of his dead lover, a woman who died in part because of him, sitting in her blood. The guilt involved in that discovery is almost impossible to overstate, and the guilt comes layered. There's the guilt of the affair, the guilt of the professional choices, the guilt of having been, in some indirect but real sense, responsible for what those two boys witnessed and experienced. Whatever Harry decided to do next, he was making that decision inside an enormous cloud of personal culpability. He adopted Dexter. He tried initially to have Brian placed with family as well, but that didn't work out, and the two brothers were separated. Harry took Dexter home and raised him. And when, over time, he recognized that Dexter was developing violent compulsions that he didn't know how to treat through conventional means, he did not go to a psychiatrist or a trauma specialist. He went to Dr. Evelyn Vogel, a neuropsychiatrist who specialized in psychopathic behavior, and together they designed a system for redirecting and containing those compulsions rather than addressing their root cause. That system is the code, and the code is not therapy, it's management. Management serves Harry's needs in ways that therapy might not. Consider what the code requires of Dexter. Stay hidden, never be caught, limit targets to people who have escaped conventional justice. If you think about this from Harry's specific position, a policeman carrying the weight of his informant lover's death, now raising her traumatized son, the code is the thing that keeps everything contained. If Dexter were discovered, the investigation into who and what Dexter is would eventually lead back to Laura, back to Harry's affair, back to questions about the circumstances of her death and Harry's role in creating the conditions for it. The code protects Harry's secret as much as it protects Dexter, perhaps more. I want to be careful here because I don't think Harry sat down at a desk one afternoon and designed a cynical system of control that served primarily to protect himself. I think Harry loved Dexter. I think the love was real and significant and consequential. But love and using someone can coexist in the same person across the same relationship without either one being insincere. And this particular instance of that combination has enormous ramifications for everything that follows. The evidence for the more uncomfortable reading of Harry's motivations comes most clearly from the manner of his death. Harry Morgan died by suicide. He overdosed on his medication. This is confirmed in Season 2 by Captain Matthews, who covered up the true cause of death to protect the family's sense of stability and to spare Dexter and Deborah from having to understand it. The official story was heart disease. The truth is that Harry, in the period immediately before he died, walked in on Dexter at work in his garage. He saw what Dexter had done to a body, and he was not proud, he was not satisfied, he vomited, He said, "Stay away," the same words Doakes would later use. And then he went home and ended his own life. Dexter hears this in season 2 and can't make sense of it. This is the man who created the code, who prepared Dexter for this life, who told him it was acceptable and manageable and even, in a sense, righteous. And that man, upon seeing the actual product of his preparation up close, chose not to continue living. The cognitive dissonance in that response is staggering. Harry spent years building toward the thing he then couldn't survive seeing. There are 2 Harrys in the show, and they coexist somewhat uneasily. There's the Harry of the flashbacks, confident, warm, principled, certain that what he's doing is right and loving and ultimately good for Dexter. And there's the Harry of the actual historical record, the man who had the affair, who carried the guilt, who designed the code as much from desperation as from care, who saw his creation functioning and walked away from the site into oblivion. The hallucination Harry that advises Dexter throughout the series is drawn almost entirely from the first version. The second version barely appears in those conversations. Dexter built himself a father who believed fully in what they were doing. Whether that construction is a form of grief or a form of denial or some combination of the two is worth thinking about. And it's the territory we'll move into when we talk about what the Harry hallucination actually is and what function it actually serves. There's also the matter of Brian. Harry knew Dexter had a biological brother. This isn't speculation. The show confirms that Matthews knew about Brian's existence, which means the information was available through police channels, which means Harry almost certainly knew. He kept that information from Dexter his entire childhood. Brian was placed somewhere in the system and grew up without the code, without the framework, without a Harry. He developed his own system, which turned out to be significantly messier and more destructive because he was designing it without a model. By season 1, Brian has become the ice truck killer. Dexter has no idea he exists, and when they finally meet, Dexter has to kill him. Whatever the reason for Harry keeping that secret, protectiveness, calculation, the difficulty of the situation, he controlled Dexter's formation absolutely. Who Dexter knew, what Dexter was told, what Dexter believed about himself and his history. That level of control goes beyond parenting into something that deserves a more precise word. Harry was an architect. He designed a person to function in a specific way for reasons that were never purely altruistic. The result of that architecture is the show we're watching. There's a specific episode in season 2 that I want to spend a moment with because it does something very precise with the Harry problem and then moves on before most viewers have time to absorb it. The episode where Dexter discovers the truth about Harry's death, that it was suicide, not heart disease, is also the episode where he gets a flashback that reframes every earlier Harry flashback retroactively. In the flashback, young Dexter is in Harry's garage. He's been doing what the code taught him to do. Harry comes in and finds him there, in the middle of what he's doing with a body. And Harry's response is not pride or satisfaction or even relief that the code is working as intended. Harry vomits. He backs away. He looks at his son with something that might be horror and says, "Stay away." And then the episode establishes he went home and took too many pills. Everything changes in those 2 details. Because the Harry in the flashbacks, the warm, measured, principled man who teaches young Dexter patiently and carefully and with apparent confidence, is suddenly revealed to have been performing confidence rather than feeling it. He believed, or convinced himself he believed, that the code was a workable framework. He invested years in preparing Dexter for it. And then he saw it in operation and it destroyed him. This creates a particular kind of tragedy around every prior Harry flashback. When you watch Harry carefully teaching young Dexter how to identify targets, how to confirm guilt, how to manage the aftermath, you now know that the man doing the teaching was carrying a version of doubt or denial that he had not fully processed. He was building the code partly because he needed to believe the code was possible. And when evidence arrived that it was not what he had told himself it was, the belief collapsed, and so did he. The tragedy extends to Dexter specifically. His most fundamental source of stability and self-understanding is a man who couldn't live with what he created. The code isn't the gift of a confident and certain father. It's the framework of a guilty and uncertain man who needed a way to make peace with something he'd set in motion. Dexter doesn't know this for most of his adult life. The hallucination, Harry certainly doesn't volunteer it. Season 8 brings Vogel, and Vogel's account of Harry is the most complete, revisionist portrait the show offers. Harry came to her with a problem he didn't know how to frame. He had this child in his house. The child was showing tendencies that Harry could see and that the available conventional frameworks, psychiatric intervention, institutionalization, didn't feel right for reasons Harry was probably only partly willing to articulate even to himself. He asked Vogel to help him find another approach. She designed the psychopath framework, the code's architecture, the intellectual structure that would give Dexter's compulsions a shape and a direction. What this means is that the code isn't Harry's invention exactly. It's a collaboration between a guilty policeman and a neuropsychiatrist with her own professional interests in how psychopaths function. Vogel had theories she wanted to test. Harry had a child he needed to manage. The code emerged from that intersection. Whether either of them had Dexter's actual well-being as their primary concern is a question the show raises without fully resolving. Vogel's patient files, which become significant later in Season 8, establish that Dexter was not the only person she had this kind of involvement with. She had relationships with other individuals she'd categorized as psychopaths, other cases where she'd developed frameworks for managing or directing their behavior. The brain surgeon, Saxon, is her biological son, another case she was involved with that went badly wrong. Her practice, it becomes clear, was partly research. She was studying psychopathic behavior, and the subjects of that study were human beings who trusted her with their most fundamental vulnerabilities. Harry, in some sense, handed his son to a researcher who had interest in the outcome beyond Dexter's flourishing. The code was designed partly to protect Dexter and Harry's secret. It was also designed partly because Vogel wanted to know if it would work. Whether the experiment succeeded depends entirely on how you define success. Something the show does that's easy to stop noticing because you get used to it very quickly is, if you look at it fresh, genuinely strange, Dexter Morgan, a man in his 30s and then 40s, carries on extended and substantive conversations with a hallucination of his dead father on a more or less regular basis. The hallucination advises him, it validates him, it pushes back on him occasionally. It provides the internal voice of the code, the thing that keeps Dexter oriented within the ethical framework Harry designed. Because the show frames these conversations as internal monologue, because we're inside Dexter's perspective throughout, watching his internal world from within, we tend to accept the Harry hallucination as a reliable presence, trustworthy, principled, a kind of embedded compass. He's the code given a face and a voice, and because we already know we're watching a man narrate his own story, we don't naturally question whether the internal figure is what it appears to be. The theory I want to put forward is that the Harry hallucination is not Dexter's conscience. It is Dexter's primary avoidance mechanism, dressed in his father's voice and operating under his father's name. The clearest evidence for this is the consistency with which the Harry voice aligns with what Dexter already wants to do. When Dexter is considering a kill, Harry doesn't usually challenge the fundamental decision. He helps Dexter assess whether the target meets the code's criteria, helps him frame the choice as justifiable, helps him proceed with a sense of structural legitimacy. When Dexter is in danger of exposure, Harry focuses almost entirely on containment. Cover your tracks, don't be seen, manage the consequences. When Dexter makes a relationship choice that serves his cover rather than his actual feelings, Harry endorses it. The pattern across all 8 seasons is remarkably consistent. The Harry voice functions as a mechanism that makes Dexter's existing intentions feel principled. A genuine conscience challenges you toward discomfort. An avoidance mechanism validates your existing direction while giving it a moral vocabulary. The Harry hallucination is extraordinarily good at the second function. It's considerably less reliable at the first. There are exceptions. Harry occasionally pushes back, occasionally expresses something like genuine concern or disappointment. But even those moments tend to be framed in terms of operational risk rather than moral weight. The most common form of Harry's challenge is, "You're going to get caught," rather than "this is wrong." The distinction matters. "You're going to get caught" is advice in service of Dexter's continued functioning. "This is wrong" is a challenge to Dexter's self-conception. The hallucination defaults to the first almost every time. The show makes the subtext fairly explicit in Season 6 in an episode called Nebraska. After Brother Sam, a faith healer and former criminal who became genuinely significant to Dexter, dies, Dexter is in a period of real internal turbulence. The Harry voice goes quiet or feels insufficient, and something else steps in. Brian Moser, Dexter's dead brother, appears in his internal landscape and takes Harry's place as the advising voice. Brian's advice is the opposite of Harry's. Stop performing, embrace what you are without framework or apology, stop maintaining the fiction of the code. Dexter notices the substitution. He actively has to choose which internal voice to follow, which version of himself to listen to. In choosing Harry over Brian, Dexter is making a choice about which psychological story he wants to inhabit. And here's what's significant about that. Both voices are him. Brian isn't external guidance any more than Harry is. Brian is the part of Dexter that wants to stop pretending. Harry's the part that has committed to the performance. The hallucination isn't a conscience inherited from an external source. It's an internal construct that organizes certain impulses and suppresses others. And it wears Harry's face because Harry is the person who originally organized those impulses into a workable system. The moment that I find most revealing comes later in Season 7. In a conversation between Dexter and the Harry hallucination, Harry says something that genuinely destabilizes Dexter. "The dark passenger was all yours. I gave you the code. I meant you were traumatized, not possessed." This is, on its face, the most honest and challenging thing the Harry voice says in the entire series. It's the hallucination naming directly that the conceptual framework Dexter uses to understand his own compulsions. The idea of a separate entity, a passenger, something distinct from himself, is a story Dexter invented, not one Harry gave him. Dexter's reaction is significant. He resists. He's troubled because if the dark passenger is just a feeling, if it's not a separate thing, but simply an expression of who he is, then he's responsible for everything. The code gave him permission to act. The passenger gave him permission to not be accountable. If the passenger goes, the accountability arrives, and the hallucination, in this one moment, is forcing Dexter to look at that. This is the only time in the series where the Harry voice functions genuinely like a conscience. And it happens to be the moment that's most threatening to Dexter's sense of self, which in a way supports the theory. A mechanism built to protect Dexter from the full weight of his own choices will occasionally, under sufficient pressure, let the real thing through. But only briefly. And then the show moves the plot forward, and the moment passes. Season 8 complicates the hallucination in interesting ways by introducing Vogel as a real, living person who actually knew Harry. Vogel brings information that the hallucination couldn't carry. A more complicated, more ambivalent, more human version of Harry than the one Dexter constructed. The real Harry came to Vogel in something closer to desperation than certainty. He didn't have a plan, he had a problem, he asked for help. That's not the Harry who shows up in the flashbacks, and it's not the Harry who lives in Dexter's head. But it might be closer to the Harry who actually existed. The hallucination is one of the most quietly interesting formal choices the show makes. It's so naturalized into the texture of the series that it barely registers as strange. But it is strange, and the strangeness is doing work. Every conversation with hallucination Harry is a conversation Dexter is having with himself, adjudicated by the part of his psychology that was most shaped by a complicated man with incomplete motives. The compass points wherever Dexter already wants to go and labels it north. The formal structure of the Harry hallucination across the series is worth paying attention to on a technical level because it changes in ways that are easy to miss if you're not tracking it carefully. In the early seasons, the hallucination functions as a fairly straightforward internal voice. It's Harry talking to Dexter, usually briefly, usually at moments of decision or stress. The conversations are short, practical, focused on the immediate problem. Harry is present but not developed as an independent presence. He exists primarily to articulate the code's requirements in Dexter's own voice. By the middle seasons, the hallucination has become more developed. Harry argues with Dexter, he expresses frustration, he shows something like disappointment. He's become a more complex internal object, which is actually consistent with how these psychological constructions work. The more time you spend with an internal representation of someone, the more elaborate it becomes, the more it takes on dimensions the real person may or may not have had. The Geller situation in Season 6 runs a specific version of this that the show handles quite carefully. Travis Marshall, the Doomsday Killer, has been having conversations with Professor Geller throughout the season that the audience initially believes are real interactions between two people. The reveal that Geller is dead, that Travis has been hallucinating his mentor, is designed to reframe the entire season, but it also functions as a mirror for Dexter's own situation. Travis and Dexter are both carrying around elaborate internal constructions of significant older men who shape their worldviews. The show is asking you to notice the parallel without making it explicitly verbal. The Geller comparison works in Dexter's favor in one obvious sense. Harry was real and shaped Dexter directly, whereas Geller had been dead for years and Travis's construction of him was entirely fantasy-based. But the parallel also suggests something uncomfortable. If Geller's advice led Travis toward escalating violence and delusion, what does that imply about Harry's advice in relation to Dexter? Both internal figures are rationalizing systems, frameworks that give permission. The quality of the rationalization differs. The function is structurally similar. Season 7's revelation that Dexter named the Dark Passenger himself, that Harry meant trauma, not possession, is one of the clearest moments in the series where the show's own critical intelligence surfaces through the hallucination. The Harry voice in that exchange is essentially telling Dexter that the story he's been using to organize his understanding of himself is insufficient. That accountability is waiting underneath it, that the distinction between I am a man who has a passenger and I'm a man who kills is not a real distinction. Dexter's resistance to this is immediate and strong. He doesn't want to follow that line of thought to its conclusion. The conversation ends, the plot moves forward, and the Harry voice returns to its usual function of helping Dexter navigate practical problems without addressing the underlying one. This is what an avoidance mechanism does when it briefly lets the truth through. It permits the truth to emerge, and then it closes the door again before the truth can fully land. The moment was real. The challenge was real, and then normal operations resumed. If you track how quickly Dexter returns to the passenger framing in subsequent episodes after that conversation, how seamlessly the vocabulary snaps back into place, you can see the mechanism reasserting itself in real time. The question the show doesn't fully answer because it can't without dismantling its protagonist entirely is what Dexter would look like without the Harry hallucination. If the Harry voice went silent, if the internal dialogue he's been having with his dead father since his 20s simply stopped, what would be left? The voiceover suggests a man who has been in continuous, elaborate conversation with himself for decades, using his father's face as the interlocutor. Remove the interlocutor and you have a man alone with his own thoughts for perhaps the first time. That sounds like a crisis, which is probably why the show never quite goes there. I want to spend some real time on Brian Moser because I think the show asks us to accept a reading of him that, on closer examination, is more complicated than it initially appears. And the theory here is one that becomes more convincing the more thoroughly you reject the frame the show provides. Brian is introduced as the season's villain. He's the ice truck killer, methodical, theatrical, always a step ahead of Miami Metro's investigation, which admittedly is not the highest bar anyone has ever cleared. The show frames him as the threat. The audience is positioned to root against him. And when Dexter ultimately kills Brian in the season 1 finale, slices his throat, stages the body as suicide, covers it up, we're designed to feel that Dexter has made the right choice. He chose Deborah. He chose his adoptive family. He chose the constructed life over the honest darkness that Brian was offering. The theory is that this is the worst choice Dexter makes in the entire series. And the show, quietly and without making a fuss about it, knows this. Think about what Brian actually does across season 1. He has discovered that his long-lost younger brother is alive, is working at Miami Metro, and is, remarkably, also a killer. He is genuinely and completely thrilled by this. His entire plan from the first crime scene is oriented around Dexter. He's not pursuing his own agenda with Dexter as a convenient cover. He is pursuing Dexter. The bloodless crime scenes are communications. The arranged bodies are invitations. He is doing everything a person with his specific psychology, skill set, and history can do to say, I see you. I know what you are. You don't have to keep pretending. Brian keeps Deborah alive through the entire season despite having access to her and ample opportunity to act otherwise. This is significant. Deborah is a Miami Metro detective actively working the ice truck killer case. She is a direct operational threat to Brian's continued freedom. The practical argument for eliminating her is obvious. He doesn't. He arranges her elaborately staged for maximum psychological impact because his intention is not her death. His intention is to force a genuine choice from Dexter. Choose me, choose honesty, choose your actual nature, or choose her, choose the performance. That's the offer. It requires her to be alive and present. When Dexter has Brian secured in the finale, their positions reversed, Brian now the one on the table. Brian's argument is straightforwardly the same argument that every therapist who appears in the series eventually makes about Dexter's situation. He is living a lie. He is performing normalcy for people who can never truly know him and who would not be able to stay if they did. He cannot love them in the way they believe he does because love requires honesty, and he is constitutionally incapable of that honesty with them. He will always be alone because the energy required to maintain the performance leaves nothing real available for actual connection. Brian is not wrong about a single element of this argument. He is completely correct. He's just delivering it while strapped to a table by his brother in an abandoned apartment, which makes it easier to dismiss. Dexter kills him anyway, and his internal monologue in the immediate aftermath, the narration he gives us right after Brian is dead, concedes the point explicitly. He thinks he was right. He was right about all of it. The show puts those words into Dexter's head and then immediately moves forward as if it hasn't just had the protagonist acknowledge that he made the wrong call. That acknowledgement is doing real work if you catch it. It means the show is not arguing that Dexter was correct to kill Brian. It's arguing that Dexter made the choice that allowed him to continue in the life he'd already built, which is not the same as the right choice, and the show knows this. Brian returns as a presence twice after his death. Briefly in Season 2, and more significantly in Season 6, functioning as the shadow version of the hairy hallucination during the Nebraska episode we discussed in the previous section. When Brian's voice takes over after brother Sam's death and leads Dexter to Nebraska for a confrontation with Jonah Mitchell, Trinity's surviving son, the arc of that episode ends somewhere unexpected. Dexter shows genuine mercy. He chooses not to kill Jonah, choosing instead to forgive, to recognize that Jonah's violence was its own kind of cry for help. The episode that begins with Brian's voice urging Dexter to embrace his nature ends with Dexter acting in a way Brian would find confusing. It's the show suggesting that neither internal voice has Dexter exactly right, that he's more than either of the stories on offer. But the core of the Brian theory doesn't depend on what he represents philosophically to Dexter's internal landscape. It depends on the simple biographical fact. Brian and Dexter came from exactly the same experience. They sat in the same blood. They witnessed the same event. They came out on the other side and developed in opposite directions, not because of any fundamental difference in who they were as people, but because of what happened to them afterward. Harry took Dexter home and built him a system. No one built Brian a system. Brian constructed his own from scratch, alone, without a model, without guidance. His system is messier and less constrained and ultimately more destructive than the code. But it is, in its own way, more honest, because it doesn't require the constant performance that the code demands. After Dexter kills Brian, he cries. This is one of the show's most important moments, and it gets very little attention because the pacing moves quickly past it. Dexter's alone with the stage body, and he sits down and cries. There's no internal monologue explaining this away. No Harry voice providing contextual framing, no justification about the code or about making the right choice. Just grief, uncurated and unmediated, for the one person in the world who actually understood where he came from. Take that grief seriously, and the rest of the original series reads differently. Every subsequent season is Dexter trying to find a version of what Brian was offering through whatever channel is available to him. Miguel Prado in Season 3, who seems briefly to understand him as a peer. Lumen Pierce in Season 5, who shares his violence and his losses, for a season before her own wounds heal enough to move on. Isaac Serco in Season 7, who respects him in a way that feels genuinely collegial, one professional to another. Hannah McKay across Seasons 7 and 8, who knows exactly what he is and chooses to stay. He keeps searching for that thing, for connection with someone who sees the real him and doesn't run. He keeps doing it while maintaining, in his narration and his self-presentation, the fiction that he doesn't need it. Brian could have given him that. It would have required Dexter to stop pretending. He chose the pretending instead, and then spent the next 6 seasons slowly losing everything he'd chosen it to protect. There's a detail about how the show handles Brian's intelligence that I want to bring up, because it's easy to miss in the forward momentum of Season 1's investigation plot. Brian is extremely good at his job, not just at killing, that part is visible and the show gives it appropriate screen time, but at reading people, at understanding motivations, at playing long games strategically. He manipulates Rudy Cooper's professional relationships with impressive subtlety. He manages Deborah's emotional attachment to him with a precision that should be frightening. He anticipates Miami Metro's investigative moves frequently enough that the department never gets close to him through conventional means. This matters because it establishes that Brian isn't simply an id figure, pure impulse and chaos, the shadow self without structure or intelligence. He's highly intelligent and strategically sophisticated. The choices he makes around Dexter are therefore deliberate rather than reactive. He's thought through what he wants, what Dexter needs to hear, what the offer has to look like to be compelling. His entire Season 1 arc is a carefully considered campaign to reach his brother. That intelligence, combined with the honesty of what he's offering, produces a character who is genuinely difficult to simply categorize as wrong. He's offering Dexter something real. Connection with someone who shares his history, honesty about who he is, freedom from the exhausting performance of the code, and he's offering it thoughtfully. The fact that the offer comes with significant collateral problems doesn't automatically invalidate it. It just makes it complicated. The argument Dexter makes to himself for killing Brian, the one the show provides through the voiceover, is essentially that Brian would always want to kill Deborah. That as long as Brian existed, Deborah was in danger because Brian saw Deborah as the thing Dexter was choosing over his real self, and Brian couldn't leave that standing. This argument is probably true as far as it goes, but it's also convenient. It's the argument that makes the killing most defensible, and Dexter is a very good lawyer for his own decisions. A less convenient argument exists alongside it. Dexter killed Brian because Brian saw him too clearly. Because the offer Brian was making required Dexter to stop being what he had built himself into, and he'd spent too long building it to dismantle it without losing everything. The code isn't just a framework for killing, it's Dexter's entire sense of self. Brian was asking him to put all of that down and start from scratch with the blood and the honesty and the brother, and that was too frightening. Even if Brian was right, the show gives this reading a small but significant piece of evidence in Season 2. In the immediate aftermath of Brian's death, when Dexter is still processing what he's done and what it means, he's incapable of killing. He attempts a kill early in Season 2 and can't complete it. He lets the target go. He attributes this to post-Brian psychological disruption, and that's the official framing the show provides. But you could equally read it as grief expressing itself in the only domain where Dexter's emotional life has any visibility. He killed his brother, and then he couldn't kill anything. That's a response the voiceover doesn't have language for. The fact that Brian returns as a vision in Season 6, rather than, say, Rita or any of the other significant dead, is meaningful. The show is acknowledging that Brian's presence in Dexter's internal landscape is specifically ongoing. He is unresolved. He is not filed away the way other deaths are filed away. He keeps coming back because the question he was asking keeps coming back. Is the performance worth what it costs? At the end of the original series, Dexter faking his death, going to Oregon, becoming a lumberjack named Jim Lindsay, that question is answered in a way that's profoundly sad if you hold it in the Brian frame. Dexter's final choice is to be alone, completely and entirely alone. The performance dropped not because he finally chose honesty, but because the performance destroyed everything and there was no one left to perform for. Brian, for all his problems, was offering something better than that. There's a reading of Brian's death that I want to put alongside the one I offered earlier, because it's less comfortable but might be more accurate. Brian is killed by Dexter in circumstances where Dexter has the upper hand physically and is already committed to the action. Brian knows by the time the conversation in the apartment is happening that it's probably going to end with him dead. His brother has made a choice and Brian can see that it's been made. The extended conversation Brian has with Dexter in those final minutes is therefore not primarily a last-ditch attempt to change Dexter's mind. It might be something closer to a final statement. He's saying the things he wants to have said. He's making his argument for the record, for whatever that's worth. This makes Brian's final monologue feel less like an antagonist's last manipulation and more like a person's last honest communication. He's not trying to trick Dexter into freeing him. He knows Dexter won't. He's telling his brother the truth one more time because it's what he's been trying to do all season, and this is the last opportunity. The truth is, you don't have to be alone. You don't have to perform this forever. There is another option, and I'm offering it, and I'm sorry you can't take it. The fact that the truth is wrapped in a worldview that includes serial killing complicates it enormously. Brian's version of "you don't have to be alone" involves a very specific kind of life that has enormous costs for a lot of people who didn't choose to be involved. It's not a simple gift, it never was. But the emotional core of what he's offering, recognition, honesty, connection, isn't wrong, and the show is careful not to let the method entirely discredit the offer. One thing I want to note about Christian Camargo's performance in those scenes, because it matters. He plays the knowledge of what's coming without defeat. Brian isn't broken in those final minutes. He's sad, maybe, but he's not pleading. He remains genuinely himself until the last moment, which is exactly what he spent the season asking Dexter to do. The actor understood clearly that Brian's consistency right up to his own death was the point. He practiced what he preached. Whatever else you want to say about Brian Moser, he wasn't a hypocrite. There's a moment in the pilot episode, the very first one, where Doakes looks at Dexter across a crime scene and doesn't look away. Everyone else is focused on the body. Doakes is looking at Dexter. There's no dialogue. He just watches, and something in his face is already filing something away. That's the whole theory in a single shot, right there in the first 40 minutes of the show. The theory is simply that Doakes is right. He is right about Dexter from the pilot episode to the last episode in which he appears. He has a clearer read of the series' protagonist than any other character in Miami Metro. And the show spends the better part of 2 seasons carefully positioning us to be relieved when he's removed from the picture. The precise quality of Doakes' perception is worth examining carefully because it isn't based on accumulated evidence or methodical investigation. It's instinctive. He clocks Dexter in their first significant scene together, and something in him registers wrongness. Not something is slightly off about this man's behavior at work, but a deeper, more physical recognition. The specific professional history that makes Doakes capable of this kind of reading is something the show gives us explicitly. He was black operations before Miami Metro. He spent time doing things in places he doesn't discuss. That background means he has genuine experience with violent people in operational contexts, and he understands that experience as information. He knows what a person who has killed looks like in their body, in the quality of their attention, in the particular kind of stillness they carry in unguarded moments. He recognizes it in Dexter immediately, and he never stops recognizing it. Every specific suspicion Doakes articulates across seasons 1 and 2 is correct. The boat, the unusual hours, the discrepancies in Dexter's story about various professional activities, the blood-slides which he eventually connects to the Bay Harbor butcher case through exactly the kind of careful lateral thinking that good investigators use. By the time we reach the Everglades cabin in Season 2, where Doakes has tracked Dexter down and confronted him directly, he has essentially resolved the entire investigation through instinct and persistence. He knows Dexter is the butcher. He has Dexter cornered. He is completely, verifiably, entirely correct. And then Lila West burns down the cabin. Lila is a woman who entered Dexter's life because Dexter needed a cover story. She is in the narrative because Dexter's choices put her there. She has no independent relationship with Doakes, no personal grievance against him, no reason to want him dead beyond the fact that she has fixated on Dexter. And Doakes is a threat to what Dexter is. She burns the cabin with Doakes inside it, and Doakes dies, and within a fairly short period, the official narrative becomes that Sergeant James Doakes was the Bay Harbor butcher, the man he was actually trying to catch. His reputation is destroyed, his career is posthumously discredited. His family's understanding of who he was is permanently altered. His death becomes the closing of the case. This is genuinely bleak in a way the show doesn't pause to acknowledge. The most accurate investigator in the history of the series, the person who followed his instincts correctly, who correctly identified the killer, who got within physical reach of actually solving it, is killed by a third party and blamed for the crime. The actual killer continues for another 6 seasons. He eventually drives his boat into a hurricane under circumstances that the franchise then reveals were not fatal, meaning Dexter not only avoided justice for the whole original run, but technically survived the closest thing to an ending the show provided. There's a dark comedy in that trajectory if you're looking for it, and I usually am, but it becomes harder to find funny the longer you think about Doakes specifically. LaGuerta never fully accepts the Doakes narrative. She says so consistently throughout the series. She maintains that he wasn't the type, that the evidence was too neat, that something in the official resolution feels wrong. She's correct about this. More correct than she knows, because she doesn't have the full picture yet. She pursues that correctness into season 7, where she reopens the case and does real investigative work and arrives at Dexter's name. But that's the next section's territory. What I want to emphasize about Doakes specifically is the experience of watching the show with Doakes as the focal point rather than Dexter. Remove the voiceover. Remove Dexter's carefully curated internal monologue that positions everything he does in context and gives it meaning. Watch what Dexter is actually doing, observe from outside the narration, and you see roughly what Doakes sees, a man with no plausible explanation for several of his behavioral patterns, whose professional knowledge is suspiciously convenient for a killer, who keeps odd hours and has unusual attachments to his boat. From that perspective, Doakes is not paranoid. He's paying attention. The show is exceptionally skilled at making you forget this when you're inside Dexter's head. Doakes is the mechanism through which the show occasionally reminds you, by giving you a scene from his perspective, that there is another way to read everything you've been watching. He functions as a periodic reality check that the narrative structurally is somewhat invested in dismissing. Because if Doakes is right, and he is, then the show's fundamental invitation to identify with and root for its protagonist is asking you to root for something that Doakes was right to try to stop. His fate is the show's most precise statement about what happens to people who see Dexter accurately while he's still operational. It's not a comfortable statement. One of the more underappreciated things about Doakes as a character is that his pursuit of Dexter is consistently professional rather than personal, at least initially. This matters because the show frames their antagonism as partly personal. Doakes finds Dexter genuinely disturbing, and Dexter finds Doakes genuinely annoying, and the friction between them has a quality that looks like personal animosity. But if you trace Doakes' actual investigative behavior, it's grounded in something more legitimate than dislike. He follows Dexter because his professional instincts tell him something is wrong. He documents what he observes because that's what an investigator does with suspicious behavior. He pursues the thread even when it's professionally inconvenient, even when keeping watch on a civilian colleague puts him outside normal channels, because he's committed to finding out what he's actually looking at. This is good police work dressed in bad social skills. The contrast with the rest of Miami Metro is instructive. Angel Batista is a better friend to Dexter than Doakes is and is a worse detective. Quinn spends years close enough to Dexter to develop genuine suspicion, and then consistently finds reasons to let it go. LaGuerta is the only other character who maintains sustained investigative interest in Dexter, and she comes to it through a different door, through Doakes' posthumous reputation, through the Bay Harbor Butcher files. Doakes got there first through instinct alone, without any of the case files that LaGuerta eventually uses. There's also the Doakes in the cabin sequence in season 2 that deserves more attention than it usually gets. Doakes is in the Everglades cabin with Dexter, and he knows. He has Dexter's slides. He has figured out enough that he could, if he were able to get out of the cabin with the evidence, effectively make the case. His position in those episodes is genuinely analogous to LaGuerta's in season 7. The right person with the right evidence in the right place at the wrong moment for the wrong reasons. What happens in those cabin episodes is that Dexter and Doakes are forced into a kind of coexistence, neither able to act on what they know about the other, stuck in a stalemate that neither of them chose. And in that coexistence, the show does something interesting. It lets Doakes' humanity show through in ways the antagonism context didn't allow for. He's not simply a threat. He's a person in an impossible situation, trying to do the right thing with the information he has, trapped by circumstances that are entirely Dexter's fault. His frustration in those episodes is legitimate. His rage is legitimate. He is the victim of the situation, and the show makes sure you see that right before Lila blows up the cabin and he becomes the villain of the official story. The Say It scene, where Doakes confronts Dexter and demands that Dexter acknowledge what he is is one of the more dramatically interesting scenes in the season precisely because Doakes is asking for the one thing that the whole show's structure is designed to prevent. He wants the truth stated out loud. He wants Dexter to stop performing. He wants basically what Brian wanted. The two most significant antagonists of the early series are both asking for the same thing: stop pretending. Both pay enormous costs for asking. The final note on Doakes is perhaps the most purely ironic thing in the show's long run. The character's most famous line, the expletive he directs at Dexter in the Season 2 finale, which became something of a cultural reference point, is an expression of frustrated recognition. He sees Dexter, he has always seen Dexter, he is surprised for a moment in that finale that Dexter has managed what Doakes has been trying to prevent. The surprise is genuine. And then he's gone. The man who was always right, surprised at the end that being right wasn't enough. Maria LaGuerta is one of the more complicated characters to talk about with genuine fairness, because the show gives you a sustained collection of reasons not to warm to her. She plays institutional politics with a fluency that can shade into cynicism. She is self-serving in ways that are visible to everyone around her and that she doesn't always bother to obscure. She has an agenda present in almost every professional interaction she has. She uses people, positions, relationships, favors as instruments in ways that feel transactional even when there's genuine warmth underneath. These qualities are real. I'm not interested in erasing them. They're in the show because they're part of who LaGuerta is, and pretending otherwise would require ignoring fairly substantial amounts of screen time. And yet, when you trace LaGuerta's actual investigative instincts across the full run of the series, not how she manages what she discovers politically, but what she actually believes and what she pursues, she is consistently, persistently, quietly correct. She doesn't accept the Doakes says butcher narrative at the moment when accepting it would be institutionally convenient and career beneficial. She keeps the question open. She maintains through multiple conversations where it costs her that something about how that investigation ended doesn't feel right. And in Season 7, when she formally reopens the Bay Harbor butcher case, she conducts the kind of methodical, evidence-based police work that should be the baseline for how investigations are run. She follows the blood slide, she cross-references the boat movements, she builds a case carefully, she arrives at the name Dexter Morgan with the evidence to support it. And then Deborah Morgan shoots her. The theory I want to put forward is that LaGuerta is the tragic hero of the entire series. Not Dexter, whose arc is about understanding what he is without ever being willing to be fully accountable for it. Not Deborah, whose arc is about the corrosive cost of protecting someone who doesn't deserve it. LaGuerta. The person doing the actual job that the institution she works for is supposed to do, following evidence to truth without the distortion of personal loyalty to the outcome. Deborah killing LaGuerta is the show's most morally significant event. I believe this more firmly every time I watch it. Not Dexter killing Trinity, which is cathartic and has its own narrative logic. Not Dexter killing Brian, which is genuinely complicated and grievous. Deborah shooting LaGuerta, a completely innocent person, the only individual in the precinct at that specific moment who is actively working toward justice, is the point at which the show makes its clearest argument. Protecting Dexter is indistinguishable from crime. It requires doing to innocent people exactly what Dexter's victims, by the code's reasoning, deserve to have done to them. The moral architecture collapses. Deborah doesn't feel good about this for a second. She doesn't walk out of that shipping container and return to her life. She is altered by that shot in ways that the show tracks carefully through Season 8. The drinking, the detachment from herself, the inability to locate solid ground, the sense of having done something she can't reconcile and can't undo. The show takes care to demonstrate that LaGuerta's death had a cost that was real and lasting. Deborah killed someone who deserved to live, and the rest of her arc is the weight of knowing it. There's something additionally painful about LaGuerta's arc when you consider her relationship with Doakes specifically. She never believed Doakes was the Bay Harbor butcher. She said so. She maintained his reputation against the institutional narrative as best she could in a context where his guilt was the official answer, and questioning it wasn't professionally safe. When she reopens the case in Season 7, part of what's driving her is loyalty to a dead colleague. She wants to know the truth about what happened to him, wants to restore his name if she can. She succeeds at both. She figures out that Doakes was framed. She identifies the real killer. She has everything she needs. She dies before she can tell anyone. Doakes is technically vindicated in the Season 7 finale, but only Dexter knows why. LaGuerta knew the full story, and she's gone. The two characters who were correct, who followed the evidence without distortion, who did the actual work of justice, are the characters the narrative clears from the board to allow the protagonist's story to continue. On a fourth viewing, that is a significantly more uncomfortable experience than it was the first time, because you know it's coming and you watch anyway and it still lands wrong. The show isn't unaware of this discomfort. Deborah's Season 8 arc is structured specifically as consequence. The writers knew that killing LaGuerta had to mean something beyond a plot mechanics, and they committed to demonstrating that it does. But the most honest thing the show does about LaGuerta is simply, it shows her doing the right thing correctly and getting shot for it. The commentary is in the event itself rather than in any character's subsequent articulation of it. She was right about everything. The records will never show it. That's not a subplot. That's the series' most honest statement about what the story it was telling actually cost. There's a particular kind of sadness in that. Not the dramatic sort, not the kind with a villain gloating somewhere, just the quiet kind, where someone did the right thing carefully and completely and then wasn't there anymore. The work was real, the work was good, the work just ran out of time. I want to spend a moment on the specific professional context LaGuerta is operating in when she reopens the Bay Harbor butcher case, because it matters for understanding what she's actually doing. By Season 7, LaGuerta is captain. She has institutional standing. She has the authority to make the call to reopen an investigation without needing approval from above. And she uses that authority in a way that is, by any professional standard, entirely legitimate. She doesn't fabricate evidence. She doesn't pursue a vendetta. She follows an evidentiary thread, a bloodslide that doesn't fit the established narrative about Doakes. And she does it because the evidence doesn't fit. Full stop. That's what she's supposed to do. The institutional environment around her is worth noting. Matthews knows more than he lets on. There are people in the department who have been protecting certain things for certain reasons across multiple seasons. LaGuerta, in pursuing this investigation, is doing something that multiple people in positions of authority would prefer she didn't do. Not because she's wrong, but because the truth she's approaching is inconvenient in ways that extend beyond Dexter specifically. What's interesting about how the show positions her in Season 7 is that it gives her genuine complexity alongside her correctness. She's still playing politics. She's still managing the investigation, partly with an eye toward her own positioning. She's not doing this purely out of devotion to justice. She's also doing it because clearing Doakes would be meaningful to her personally, and because being the person who exposed a wrongful conviction and identified the real killer would be significant professionally. These motivations coexist with the legitimate investigative ones, and the show doesn't pretend otherwise. But here's the thing. Motivations don't determine whether you're right. LaGuerta's mixed motivations don't make her wrong about the evidence. She reaches correct conclusions through a combination of legitimate investigation and personal investment, and the combination is messy and human and entirely real. Presenting LaGuerta as a tragic hero doesn't require pretending she was purely virtuous. It requires acknowledging that she was doing her job correctly in the way that mattered most, following the evidence to where it actually led, and that she was killed for it. The season-long arc of Deborah's moral compromise is framed around LaGuerta in ways that deserve attention. Deborah knows by late in season 7 that LaGuerta is getting close. She knows what LaGuerta will find if she continues. She makes a series of decisions across the final episodes of that season, helping Dexter create an alibi, interfering with the investigation in small ways that move her from observer to participant in covering up what Dexter is. By the time she pulls the trigger in the shipping container, she's already deeply implicated. The trigger pull is not a sudden moral collapse, but the culmination of a series of smaller ones. That arc for Deborah is genuinely well constructed, and it requires LaGuerta to be genuinely right. Because if LaGuerta were slightly less correct, if her investigation were in any way off track or flawed or misguided, then Deborah's choices could be read differently. The show makes sure LaGuerta is absolutely right about everything so that Deborah's choices to stop her are absolutely indefensible. The tragedy is airtight. LaGuerta was right. Deborah knew she was right, and Deborah shot her anyway. One element of the LaGuerta arc that deserves a little more attention is her relationship with the institutional machinery around the Bay Harbor butcher case. Specifically, how much she's fighting against established institutional inertia rather than just pursuing evidence. By the time she reopens the case in season 7, the Bay Harbor butcher narrative has been settled for several years. Doakes has been the official answer for a significant portion of the department's institutional memory. The case is closed. The FBI concluded it. A lot of careers and reputations are implicitly built on the Doakes resolution being correct. LaGuerta reopening it isn't just a professional choice. It's a challenge to an institutional position that a lot of people have a stake in maintaining. Matthew's resistance to her investigation throughout season 7 needs to be understood in this context. He's not simply covering for Dexter out of loyalty, though there may be some of that. He's also protecting an institutional settlement that he was part of creating, and he's worried about what unraveling it would mean for everyone involved, including himself. The Bay Harbor butcher case closing the way it did benefited a lot of people professionally. LaGuerta threatening to reopen it is threatening a lot of interests simultaneously. This makes her investigative courage more significant, not less. She's not operating in a neutral environment where the truth is simply waiting to be found. She's working against institutional gravity, against the department's preference that the settled narrative stay settled, against her superior's explicit instruction, against the professional and political consequences of being wrong if she pursues this and doesn't find what she's looking for. She does it anyway, because the evidence doesn't fit, and she can't leave evidence that doesn't fit unexamined. That's the definition of good police work. The fact that it gets her killed in a shipping container is the show's most precise statement of what good police work costs, when the person being investigated is also the person responsible for the circumstances of your death. The shipping container in season 7's finale where LaGuerta dies is not accidental. The show is closing the loop. The container is where it all started, and here's another person ending in a container because of what started there. The location is doing thematic work even in the moment that looks most like pure plot mechanics. Season 4 of Dexter is the peak of the original series by most assessments, and the reasons are numerous and have been well documented. John Lithgow's Arthur Mitchell is the most fully realized antagonist the show ever produced, a fact the Emmy committee agreed with. The season finale is genuinely devastating in ways that mainstream television drama rarely manages to be. The long shadow it casts over everything that follows is one of the reasons the franchise is still operating more than 15 years later. But what I want to focus on tonight is not season 4 as great television. I want to focus on what the Trinity arc is actually arguing at the level of theme, because I think the theory embedded in it is one of the show's most deliberate and structurally complete. Arthur Mitchell is not in the narrative simply as a worthy antagonist for Dexter to pursue and eventually neutralize. He is in the narrative as a demonstration. He is the show's answer to a question Dexter has been asking in various forms since the series began. Is it possible to have both? Can you maintain a family, a real one with genuine people in it, while also being what I am? Is there a version of this life where the two parts coexist without destroying each other? The setup is elegant. Early in Season 4, Dexter observes Arthur from a careful distance before he understands what he's looking at. What he sees appears to be the affirmative answer to those questions. Trinity has been killing for decades. His body count runs into dozens across multiple cities in 30 years. He has a wife, children, a home, a church community, a large-scale charity project, building homes for families in need. He coaches youth sports. He is, from the outside, an exemplary citizen. From Dexter's perspective, a man actively trying to do exactly this, to be the blood spatter analyst and the husband and the father and the killer, to hold all of it simultaneously. Arthur looks like proof. You can have the domestic life alongside the dark one. You just have to be disciplined enough, careful enough, committed enough. The season's entire structural movement is the systematic dismantling of that impression. Layer by layer, the reality of the Mitchell household becomes visible, and it is a horror. Sally, Arthur's wife, has been psychologically destroyed across decades of sustained abuse. She flinches, she apologizes reflexively. She has learned to read Arthur's mood from across a room and adjust her behavior accordingly in ways that have become completely automatic, completely subconscious. Jonah, their son, is trapped in something between resentment and terror. Desperate to escape, unable to, carrying the bruises from a father who hits him and explains it as discipline. Rebecca, their daughter, walks on eggshells constantly and has learned not to expect safety from the person who is supposed to provide it. The family Arthur has built, the cover, the proof of normalcy, the community face, is a place of sustained, long-term terror for every person who actually lives inside it. The children and wife aren't his cover. They're his first victims, the ones he doesn't kill, but who absorb the full weight of what he is on a daily basis. The parallel being established is not subtle, but it's effective. Dexter's observation of the Mitchell household happens at the same time as a period of increasing strain in his own. Rita is frustrated with Dexter's absence and distraction. The children don't get the father they need because the father they have is elsewhere most of the time. The marriage is being held together by Rita's considerable patience and Dexter's considerable performance abilities rather than by genuine presence. The show doesn't underline the parallel loudly, but it's tracking both simultaneously, letting you draw the comparison yourself. And then the mechanism of Arthur's killing cycle is revealed to be autobiographical. The bathtub kill, the fall from height, the burial in concrete, each element corresponds to a death in Arthur's own family history. His sister drowned in a bathtub because of his carelessness. His mother jumped from a building because she couldn't survive what happened. His father died in a concrete accident. Arthur has been ritually recreating his family's destruction for 3 decades, without ever having addressed what that destruction actually was or did to him. That detail stopped me cold the first time I really understood what the show was saying. He's not a killer with a pattern, he is a pattern. Every cycle is his family dying again, in miniature, endlessly. His compulsion is not separate from his trauma. It is his trauma expressed outward as repetitive violence that solves nothing and heals nothing and circles back to the same point every time. This is the show's clearest mirror for Dexter. We established in the Harry section that the code is management rather than healing, and Arthur is what management looks like when it runs for 30 years with nothing underneath it. Both men arrived at the same strategy: contain the damage, channel the compulsion, keep the two lives from touching each other. The only operational difference is that Dexter has a framework limiting who gets hurt. The mechanism they're both running on is the same. The theory, stated plainly, Trinity is not a villain Dexter defeats. He's a destination Dexter avoids. He is what the trajectory of Dexter's situation points toward. Not because Dexter lacks love or care or conscience, but because the strategy of managing rather than addressing produces a particular kind of result over sufficient time. and Arthur Mitchell is what sufficient time looks like. And then Trinity kills Rita, and the theory becomes something harder to look at than a theory. Rita dies not because Dexter failed to protect her in any conventional sense. He kills Arthur at the end of the finale, too late but definitively. She dies because Dexter kept Arthur alive longer than the code required because he was studying him, learning from him, identifying with him. His hesitation and his fascination, his recognition of Arthur as a kind of self, is what creates the window in which Rita becomes a victim. The mirror he was examining turned out to be a window. Harrison in the bathtub of Rita's blood is the show completing its own logic. The container has reproduced itself. The wound moves to the next generation. Whether Dexter processes this correctly or carries it forward is the question that organizes the remaining 4 original seasons and ultimately both franchise continuations. Something the show establishes about Arthur Mitchell that sometimes gets overlooked in discussions of the Trinity arc is how long he's been doing this. His killing cycle began, the investigation eventually reveals, roughly 30 years before season 4. That's 3 decades of the same pattern, the same ritual, the same cycle of bathtub, fall, concrete, boy, repeat. He has done this so many times that it has become completely automatic. The compulsion is so deeply grooved into his psychology that he could probably walk through the steps in his sleep. This temporal dimension matters for the theory because it gives the mirror a depth that makes it genuinely frightening rather than just thematically neat. Trinity isn't showing Dexter what he might become in some abstract future. He's showing him what 30 years of the same strategy looks like when it's fully developed. Not the beginning of the pattern, which is what Dexter is living when they meet, but the end point of it. The fully realized version of a life organized around this kind of compulsion. And the fully realized version is a household in terror and a man who has been ritualizing his family's destruction for 3 decades and has never once come close to addressing what that destruction actually was. The show gives us a scene between Dexter and Arthur that is one of the more carefully constructed exchanges in the whole series. Dexter, operating as Kyle Butler, spends time with Arthur in his community context, at the 4 walls, 1 heart build site, at his church, in his social world, and he watches how Arthur functions in these spaces. Arthur's genuinely good at the performance. He's warm and engaged and apparently invested in the community around him. He's building houses for people who need them, and the people who work alongside him seem to respect and like him. From inside that context, he's an admirable figure. Dexter finds this compelling because it's exactly what he wants to be. He wants the forensic lab and the family and the community standing to be real, not performance. He wants to be the person that Arthur appears to be in those public spaces. And Arthur appears to have achieved it, or to have maintained it for long enough that the achievement looks solid. The reveal is that it's all performance, all the way down. Arthur functions well in public contexts where he's in control of the interaction. Put him in private contexts where control is ambiguous, the household, the relationships where the other people have their own needs and responses, and the violent surfaces. The public Arthur is a skin, the household Arthur is the reality, and after 30 years, the reality has entirely consumed the skin. Dexter's situation in season 4 is earlier in that trajectory. He still has genuine things. Rita is a real relationship, even if he doesn't have the language to fully understand what it is. The children are a real attachment, but the trajectory, the increasing difficulty of maintaining the dual life, the growing friction between the domestic space and the dark one, the way his attention keeps splitting and splitting until there's not enough of it for either. That trajectory has an endpoint, and Trinity is it. One of the smaller, more precise details the show uses to connect Dexter and Trinity thematically is the car. Arthur drives a convertible, a prized possession, a symbol of his controlled public self. And he is protective of it almost to the point of irrationality. When Dexter, still as Kyle Butler, accidentally damages it during their time together, Arthur's reaction is disproportionate and reveal something of the control obsessive underneath the community benefactor surface. Dexter has his boat in the same functional role, the private space, the thing that is entirely his, the domain where he doesn't have to maintain the performance. The parallel is not accidental. Both men have claimed a vehicle as their sanctuary from the demands of the life they've built around the dark thing they are. One thing I want to revisit from the Trinity section, because it's something I find myself still thinking about well after the season is over. The scene where Dexter and Arthur are in the van together on the road after Dexter has let him go rather than killing him. They're driving, they're talking, and for a stretch of time, they're just two men in a vehicle having a conversation. And the conversation is almost, not quite, but almost ordinary. This scene is uncomfortable in a specific way that's hard to name. It's uncomfortable because you can see, watching it, that Dexter likes Arthur, not the Arthur who abuses his family, not the Arthur in the kill ritual. The Arthur who is charming and engaged and, when he's not being what he is, genuinely interesting to spend time with. Dexter finds him good company. And Arthur, who has correctly identified that Dexter is not what he appears to be either, is comfortable with Dexter in a way he's not comfortable with other people. They recognize each other, two men maintaining elaborate performances for the world around them, each having spotted the other's fakery, and therefore each able to drop slightly more of the performance than they can with anyone else. It's the closest thing to honest interaction that Dexter has with any character outside of Brian in Season 1. And it lasts exactly until Dexter finds out about the boy in Trinity's cycle, the disappearing child who precedes every bathtub kill, and understands what he's been sitting in the van with. The recognition, turning to horror arc of Dexter's relationship with Trinity over the season is one of the more carefully constructed emotional arcs in the original series. He goes from fascination to identification to friendship to horror to rage without any of the transitions feeling forced. And the fascination is real, not just strategic. Dexter wasn't studying Trinity purely as a professional project. He was studying him the way you study something you see yourself in, with attention and recognition and a thread of something that might be hope. The hope being, if Arthur can do this, maybe I can do this. Maybe the family and the dark thing can coexist. Maybe I don't have to choose. Rita's death in the finale is the show answering that hope. Directly, definitively. No, the family and the dark thing cannot coexist. Not because you lack the intelligence or the commitment or the love, but because the dark thing will eventually reach the people you're trying to protect, regardless of how carefully you manage it, because you're made of it and the people you love are close to you. Trinity didn't want to kill Rita. He didn't target her personally. She died as part of a cycle that Arthur couldn't stop even when he tried to. The show confirms that Arthur made efforts at various points to end his pattern and couldn't. The compulsion is not fully under voluntary control. That's the thing Dexter has been telling himself it is. The Harrison theory operates across two distinct time frames in the franchise, and I think it's worth being precise about the distinction. There's what the original series sets up, retrospectively visible once you know what becomes of it, and there's what New Blood and Resurrection actually confirm and develop. These are related but slightly different arguments, and they're worth holding separately even as they illuminate each other. In the original series, Harrison is largely a plot element. He's the infant who requires protection. He's the reason Rita's death is not just a character loss, but a structural rupture. He becomes a single parent's child, then absent father's concern, then the reason Dexter eventually chooses to disappear. Harrison as a person, as a developing psychology, is not something the original series has much time for. He's present but not focused on. But the setup is entirely there. This is the point. An infant who sat in his mother's blood for some period before anyone arrived to find him, who grew up in a household that was already strained before Rita died and definitively fractured afterward, who lost Rita to violence, then lived with a grieving father who was not genuinely available even when physically present, then lost that father, believed he lost him. When Dexter disappeared after Deborah's death in the season 8 finale, The conditions that produce Dexter's psychology are reproduced in Harrison's childhood in different configurations, but with comparable weight. You don't have to be a developmental psychologist to see the parallel the show is constructing. The theory the original series is quietly advancing is that the moment Harrison was placed in that bathtub in the season 4 finale, when the camera holds on that image of infant in blood, the show made a promise about where the franchise would eventually go. Not immediately, not urgently, but eventually. The shipping container echo we discussed in section 1 is too precise to be architectural coincidence. The show is saying, this child carries something now. What that something becomes depends on what happens next. What happened next was not straightforwardly good. A grieving single father doing his best while also being a serial killer. A succession of female caretakers and situational family configurations. A father who then disappeared entirely, leaving Harrison with the particular variety of abandonment that has a body and a face, and is therefore not abstract. New Blood fills in what the original series left blank. Harrison has been self-harming. He's been drawn toward violent situations and violent people. He found Dexter through years of deliberate searching, not because he had information, but because he needed to, because the absence of his father had left a specific shape of father-sized wound that he couldn't leave alone. The self-harm detail is the one I keep returning to, because it's the show's most precise statement about how Harrison's version of the wound is oriented. Dexter's compulsions moved outward, toward targets, toward the kill room, toward managing violence as something that happened to other people. Harrison's compulsions, as we find them in New Blood, have been moving inward. He's been hurting himself. That's a meaningful difference from where Dexter landed, and it suggests Harrison's wound is structured somewhat differently, which makes sense given that the experiences that produced it are different in important ways. Dexter's trauma was external and sudden. Harrison's is a combination of acute early experience and sustained relational deprivation. Different inputs, recognizably related outputs. When Harrison kills Kurt Caldwell before Dexter can get there, takes independent action while Dexter is still in the planning stage. The scene is genuinely difficult to read cleanly. Harrison isn't monstrous. He's killing someone who has been genuinely predatory, someone who has harmed people and would harm more. The action itself, stripped of the context of how he arrived at it, looks something like the code. But he arrives at it without the code's framework, without Harry's architecture, without Vogel's clinical design. He acts on instinct and urgency. That's closer to Brian than to Dexter. Immediate rather than procedural. Raw rather than constructed. The ending of New Blood, Harrison shooting Dexter, is the theory completing itself across the franchise. The child who sat in his mother's blood grew up, understood what his father was, and made a decision about what that meant. The decision is ambiguous enough to sustain multiple readings. Mercy, justice, self-protection. The ending of a cycle that he could see was going to continue as long as Dexter was alive and operational. The show presents it as a morally serious choice rather than a simple heroic or villainous action, which is the right call. Whatever it was, it had been coming since 2009. Resurrection complicates the ending New Blood offered because Dexter survived. He was resuscitated in an emergency room and is now in New York, which introduces questions about whether Harrison's action meant what the ending of New Blood seemed to say it meant. If Dexter simply continues, new city, new name, new antagonists, then the cycle wasn't ended, it was relocated. If Resurrection is building towards something more conclusive, then maybe Harrison's shot was the beginning of a conclusion rather than the conclusion itself. I have genuine uncertainty about this, and I think that's actually an interesting place to be with an ongoing franchise rather than a frustrating one. The element of the Harrison theory I want to close on is the role of the father's absence specifically. Dexter's trauma involved blood and sudden loss, and what a mind does when formed in extreme conditions. That's a particular kind of wound. Harrison's carries all of that, but it also carries the specific weight of being left, of having a father who was there and then wasn't, who disappeared and didn't explain, who chose, as Harrison would understand it, something else overstaying. That kind of abandonment doesn't just leave a gap. It leaves a question that the abandoned person tends to carry for a very long time. What was wrong with me that made leaving seem like the better option? There's a question buried in the Harrison arc that I don't think the franchise has fully answered yet, and I'm genuinely curious how Resurrection will address it. What does Harrison want? In New Blood, Harrison's motivations are relatively legible. He wants his father. He wants to understand where he comes from and what he carries. He's dealing with something in himself. The compulsions, the self-harm, the gravitational pull toward violence. That makes more sense if he can understand his father's version of the same thing. Finding Dexter isn't just about reconnection. It's about self-knowledge. He's looking for the context that makes him coherent. What he finds in New Blood is complicated. He finds a father who has been suppressing himself successfully for a decade under a false name in a small upstate New York town, and who then begins to unsuppress when Harrison arrives. He finds out what his father is. He watches Dexter operate for a while. He develops his own relationship with the compulsion, killing Kurt Caldwell being the significant event, the one that makes him most like Dexter while simultaneously being the thing that clarifies why Dexter has to stop. The shot at the end of New Blood is Harrison choosing consciously not to become the next version of the cycle. He is the child who sat in his mother's blood, who grew up and understood, eventually, what that blood was doing in the world. His choice to end it is the franchise's most hopeful possible reading of the whole arc. The wound can be seen clearly enough that the person who carries it can decide not to pass it on. That's genuinely something. But Resurrection reveals that Dexter survived, which opens a set of questions about what Harrison thinks about that and what he does with it. If he shot his father to end something and his father is now alive in New York, still being what he is, still operating, still Dexter Morgan under whatever new name, what does that mean for the choice Harrison made? Did it mean anything? Does he feel responsible? Does he feel deceived? Does he feel relieved? These questions matter because they're the difference between Harrison being an agent of something meaningful and Harrison being a plot mechanism that the franchise reversed for commercial reasons. How Resurrection answers them will determine whether New Blood's ending was a conclusion or a pause. The one piece of the Harrison theory I find most moving and most consistent with everything the show has built. Harrison is the first person in the franchise's entire run who has the original trauma and the full knowledge of what it produces and the opportunity to choose differently. Dexter didn't have the full knowledge, he was shaped by Harry before he had the capacity to interrogate that shaping. Brian didn't have the framework. He developed alone and without a model for anything else. Harrison has both the history and the awareness of it. He's the first person in the sequence who is genuinely choosing rather than being shaped without full consent. What he does with that choice, in Resurrection going forward, is the most interesting question the franchise is currently sitting with. The last theory tonight is structurally different from the others. The previous 8 are about specific characters, specific events, specific patterns in the story. This one is about the form of the story itself, about how it's told and what that means for how we understand everything we've been told. Dexter Morgan narrates his own story to the audience throughout the series. He tells us what he thinks, what he feels or doesn't feel, what the dark passenger requires, what his motivations are, what the code demands of him in any given situation. This narration is the defining formal characteristic of the show. It's the mechanism that creates intimacy with a protagonist who would otherwise be essentially alienating. Without the voiceover, Dexter is a man who kills people in organized, hygienic ways and then goes home to his family. With the voiceover, he's a complicated inner life we're invited to live inside. The voiceover is what makes the show work on its primary level. The theory is the narrator is not telling us the whole truth, possibly not even to himself. Let me be careful about how I mean this. This isn't the theory that Dexter is consciously deceiving the audience, that he knows things and withholds them strategically as a storytelling maneuver. It's subtler than that. Dexter is, by his own account and by sustained observable evidence throughout the series, a compulsive and expert liar. He lies to every significant person in his life on a constant basis. He lies to Deborah, he lies to Rita, he lies to his colleagues, he lies to the people he's about to kill, often in elaborately constructed ways. He is so habitually dishonest with everyone around him that deception has become his default mode of engaging with the world. So the question the show embeds but never asks out loud, why would the internal narration be the exception to this pattern? Why would a person who lies about everything else be completely honest in his own internal monologue? The most obvious gap between narration and evidence is in Dexter's consistent claim about his emotional life. He tells us he doesn't feel things, not love, not grief, not genuine connection, not empathy in any conventional sense. He positions his relationships as maintenance activities, covers he cultivates because they provide protective coloration. Rita, he tells us in early seasons, was mostly useful before becoming something more. And even that something more is framed carefully, qualified heavily, presented as unusual and not to be fully trusted. And then his behavior contradicts this consistently and specifically. He cries, genuinely cries, with no audience and no strategic purpose. When Brian dies, he is visibly and completely devastated when Rita is killed, not operationally disrupted, but genuinely destroyed by it. And the scenes immediately following her death are among the most unguarded in the whole series. He sacrifices enormous amounts of his own safety and stability for Deborah's sake, repeatedly in ways that serve no strategic function and that the code would not require of him. When Deborah dies at the end of season 8 and he disconnects her from life support, the show doesn't play this as a logical decision within the code's framework. It plays it as grief, as a form of love expressing itself in the only way available to it. 2 readings of this gap are available. The first, Dexter has poor self-insight. He genuinely believes he doesn't feel things and he is simply wrong about himself. His self-model is inaccurate, and the behavior we see is the truth that his narration is getting wrong. The second, the narration is itself a kind of performance, a story Dexter tells himself about what he is, because feeling things fully and openly is genuinely dangerous for someone whose losses arrived so early and so completely. He narrates himself the way he'd narrate a forensic case, clinically at a remove with professional vocabulary and systematic detachment, because the alternative is to be inside the feelings rather than above them. And being inside the feelings was the experience that produced the compulsions in the first place. I lean toward the second reading, with some of the first mixed in. The combination produces a narrator who partly believes what he's telling you and partly needs to believe it in order to continue functioning, which is a recognizable and very human position to be in. The Dark Passenger is the clearest example of the narration doing this specific work. We've touched on it already in the context of Harry's hallucination, but here it deserves its own attention. The Dark Passenger is Dexter's term for his compulsive drive to kill. He invented the term himself. This is explicitly stated in the show, in the conversation we talked about earlier, where Harry's hallucination tells Dexter he gave him the code, but the Dark Passenger was all his own. The passenger is not a clinical term. It's not from Vogel's framework or Harry's preparation. It's a story Dexter told himself at around age 12 to explain something he was experiencing and didn't have language for. As we talked about earlier, the passenger framing puts the killer at a remove, something Dexter carries rather than something he is. The narration maintains that framing carefully and continuously, presenting the passenger as slightly external even while acknowledging it's always present. It's the conceptual distance the narration needs to keep functioning. But the behavior tells a different story. The planning, the slide collection, the care in choosing targets, the intellectual pleasure in the forensic analysis that his work provides, the organization and precision of the kill rooms. These aren't the actions of someone being driven by an external force that they're passively carrying. These are the actions of someone who is engaged, interested, and invested. Someone who gets something real from what they're doing. The passenger framing is the narration maintaining a comfortable distance from a more uncomfortable truth. That the killer is Dexter entirely, without the separation the passenger story provides. What this means practically, for how you engage with the show, is that the moments where behavior contradicts narration are the most truthful moments. The tears after Brian's death are more honest than anything the voiceover says about not feeling things. The reckless, non-strategic ways Dexter puts himself at risk for Deborah tell you more about how he feels about her than any narrated description of his attachment to her. Action is harder to control than language. The narration is the story Dexter tells. What he does is the story that's actually true. The show built its entire structure on the intimacy of that internal voice, and then embedded throughout evidence that the voice isn't fully reliable. Most people accept the narration at face value and have a fine time watching the show that way, which is a completely valid approach. But if you hold the narration at a slight distance and watch what Dexter does rather than what he says about what he does, a different version of the series emerges underneath the one on the surface. One where a person who experienced catastrophic early loss constructed a very elaborate story about himself. The dark passenger, the code, the man who doesn't feel things, and then spent his entire adult life acting in ways that quietly, persistently contradicted it. I want to bring up one specific structural element of the narration that doesn't get discussed as much as I think it should: the opening sequence. Every episode of the original series opens with Dexter's morning routine. The alarm, the preparing of the coffee, the shaving, the blood slide, the ritual of getting ready. And it's narrated in voiceover in a way that explicitly frames the ordinary activities as the surface over something else. The show is already telling you right there in the morning routine, we are watching a performance of normalcy. The careful framing of the mundane, the orange juice, the meat, is already drawing attention to how constructed the presentation is. Dexter narrating his own breakfast is not natural. Normal people don't narrate their breakfasts, even internally. The narration's presence in those quotidian moments is the show saying, this is being managed, this is deliberate, this is someone maintaining a performance. By putting the voiceover over the most ordinary moments of Dexter's day, the show is already making the unreliable narrator argument without explicitly making it. If the narration is present in the mundane moments, if Dexter is narrating himself making coffee, then the narration is always on. It's not activated by unusual events. It's continuous. And if it's continuous maintenance of a particular self-presentation, which is what the theory claims. The Showtime series did something quite smart with the narration in Season 7 when Deborah discovers the truth about Dexter. For a few episodes, there are scenes between Dexter and Deborah where the voiceover is absent or substantially reduced. These are some of the most dramatically raw scenes in the series, and I think the reduced narration is part of why, without the voiceover buffering the experience, Dexter's situation is just present on the screen, unmediated. He's not narrating himself through it, he's just in it. And those scenes feel different from the ones surrounded by voiceover in ways that are hard to articulate but genuinely felt. The novels offer an interesting comparison point here, though the show diverges from them significantly, and the books shouldn't be used to make claims about the show's intentions. In Jeff Lindsay's books, the dark passenger eventually acquires something closer to genuinely supernatural status. It's less clearly just a psychological construct and more clearly something else. The show explicitly doesn't go there. The show keeps the dark passenger as a psychological phenomenon throughout, and the Season 7 exchange where Harry's hallucination says it was all Dexter is the show's clearest statement of that position. What's interesting about this choice is what it means for the narration. If the dark passenger were genuinely supernatural, if there were something other than Dexter himself generating the compulsions, then the voiceover's framing of it as an external thing would be accurate rather than self-serving. By choosing the psychological reading, the show ensures that every time the voiceover refers to the passenger as something distinct from Dexter, it's wrong. Not maliciously wrong, but wrong in the way that people are wrong about themselves when they've been telling themselves a particular story for long enough. You can usually spot an unreliable narrator when what they tell you starts to diverge from what the story otherwise shows. Dexter is an unusually clear version of this because the show gives you both the narration and the behavior in the same frame and trusts you to notice when they pull apart. Most viewers accept the narration at face value. The theory just takes the gaps between the two seriously. There's a connecting thread running through everything we've talked about tonight. I noticed it somewhere around the third theory, and it hasn't entirely left me since. Every single one of these, the shipping container as architecture, Harry's dual agenda, the hallucination father as avoidance mechanism, Brian as the honest version of the same man, Doakes seeing clearly, LaGuerta doing real justice, Trinity as a mirror and a warning, Harrison inheriting the wound he was born into, the narration as a performance of not feeling. Every single one of them is asking a version of the same question. What does it cost to not be honest about what you are? Dexter spends the whole series managing and containing and redirecting and performing. He builds systems, the code, the kill room, the voiceover, that keep the real thing at a manageable distance, even from himself. And the argument the show makes, gradually and without much loud announcement, is that this containment strategy doesn't hold. It leaks, it spreads, it gets into the people around him in ways he didn't intend and can't undo. The blood stays managed in the plastic sheeting on the walls, but what he is gets into everything else regardless. Brian knew this. Doakes could see it. LaGuerta tried to prove it with evidence. Trinity demonstrated what it looks like at the far end of 30-plus years of the same strategy. Harrison finally ended it, or tried to. And Dexter, through 9 seasons of the franchise and still going in Resurrection, is only now starting to grapple seriously with the possibility that the story he's been telling about himself, the dark passenger, the man who doesn't feel, the driver who is separate from what he carries, might not be the whole story. That the feelings he's been narrating himself away from might be the thing he actually needs to spend some time inside rather than above. Whether he gets there, I genuinely don't know yet. I have cautious hopes and some skepticism in roughly equal measure, which feels like an honest place to be with a franchise that has surprised me before and disappointed me before, and occasionally done both at the same time. Wherever you are tonight, whether you've been watching Dexter since the first season aired in 2006 and remember what it felt like before you knew how Rita's story ended, or you came to it recently and binged it in a week, or you're somewhere in the middle of a 3rd or 4th rewatch, and some of what we've talked about tonight is going to make certain scenes significantly more uncomfortable when you get back to them. I hope this was a good way to spend an evening. I hope it was comfortable company. These theories don't damage the show. I want to be clear about that. In the same spirit, I've tried to be clear about everything else tonight. Noticing the layers underneath a piece of storytelling is an act of engagement, not attack. You don't spend this much time with something you don't care about. The fact that Dexter still rewards this kind of close attention after all this time, that there are still new things to find in it on a careful watching, that the franchise is still generating new material worth thinking about, is evidence that it built something durable underneath the thriller surface. I remain genuinely fond of this series, its imperfections fully included. Some seasons hold up better than others, which is true of almost every show that runs for 8 years. The original finale is a conversation I'll probably have in a dedicated video at some point because it deserves more space than a passing mention. New Blood is a complicated viewing experience that I have complicated feelings about. And Resurrection is currently in the process of deciding what all of this means at the franchise level, and I'm watching with genuine curiosity. In a future video, I'd love to spend a whole evening just on the Trinity arc in Season 4. Not the investigation and the procedural elements, but Arthur Mitchell's full backstory and what the show is doing with it across that year. There's significantly more there than we had time for tonight. I also want to do a dedicated video on Deborah eventually. Her arc from Season 1 through Season 8 is one of the most complete character trajectories in the series. And the question of whether the show is finally fair to her and how it ends is one I keep returning to without landing on a settled answer. And New Blood deserves its own full evening properly. The ending divided people sharply, and I understand why, and I have a lot of thoughts that I couldn't fit into tonight's framing. But that's for another evening. For now, the dark passenger can rest. Settle in wherever you've gotten to by this point, and I'll see you next time. Sweet dreams. I want to end with something that occurred to me while I was thinking through these theories, which is that all of them converge on an argument about stories. Dexter lives inside a story he tells about himself. The story has a protagonist, a man with a dark passenger shaped by extraordinary circumstances operating under an elegant code. The story has an antagonist force, the compulsion, the passenger, the thing that must be managed. The story has a setting, Miami Metro, the kill room, the boat, the life. It's a coherent narrative, and it allows Dexter to understand himself in a way that is bearable. The code makes him a kind of hero. The passenger makes him a kind of victim. The performance keeps the worst of it at bay. Every theory we've discussed tonight is, at its core, about what happens when someone else's story intersects with that narrative. Brian's story says, the character you've named the passenger is actually you, and you are lying to yourself. Doakes' story says, I can see what the narrative is hiding, and it's hiding a killer. LaGuerta's story says, the institutional narrative around this case is wrong, and I'm going to prove it. Harrison's story says, I'm the consequence of this narrative, and the consequence needs to end it. The show's most honest moments are the ones where Dexter's story gets interrupted by someone else's, where the narration goes quiet and the reality is just there, without commentary, where what Dexter does can't be explained away by the passenger or justified by the code and has to be seen plainly for what it is. Those moments are rarer than you might expect in a show this long. The narration is good at closing ranks, at restoring the story's integrity after it's been challenged, at returning to the stable version of events after a destabilization. But the moments of interruption are there across the full run of the series, if you watch for them. The theory is that those moments are the show telling you more truth than the narration ever does, and that together they add up to something like what actually happened. It's been a good evening to spend thinking about this. It always is.